There are moments in history that don't just shake a nation, they shake the world's conscience. Moments that leave behind more than destruction. They leave behind questions, questions that demand answers, questions that expose pride, power, and the silence that follows when the powerful fall. The night Iran struck and Israel's pride was brought low, that was one of those moments. Not because of the missiles, not because of the headlines, but because of what it revealed about us, about nations, about humanity, about the price of pride and the cost of silence. You see, it's easy to talk about strength. It's easy to celebrate power when it's in your hands. But what happens when that power is tested? What happens when pride invites a storm? And what happens when the world watches that storm unfold and says nothing? That's the lesson. That's the warning. That's what we need to face. Pride is one of those forces that creeps in slowly. It doesn't always announce itself with loud words or grand gestures. Sometimes it looks like confidence. Sometimes it feels like certainty. Sometimes it wears the mask of strength. But when pride is left unchecked, when it grows without reflection, when it feeds on power and applause, it becomes dangerous. It blinds. It whispers that you are above consequence, that you are untouchable, that you are the exception to the rule. And that's when the fall begins, not in the moment of defeat, but in the moments when pride convinced you it could never happen. The higher you climb with pride at your back, the harder the fall will be. Because pride doesn't just lift you up, it isolates you. It pushes away wisdom. It pushes away warning signs. It pushes away voices that might have helped you see what was coming. Pride tells you to ignore the storm on the horizon. Pride tells you that your strength will be enough, that your position will protect you, that your power will silence your enemies, shield you from consequence, secure your place at the top. But the truth is, pride builds a house on sand. And when the storm comes, and it always comes, that house can't stand. Unchecked pride invites destruction because it convinces you that preparation is weakness. It convinces you that you don't need to listen, that you don't need to learn, that you don't need to reflect. It convinces you that you've arrived, that you've conquered, that nothing can touch you now. And that's when the cracks start forming. Quiet at first, easy to miss, but they grow, they spread. And by the time pride lets you see them, it's too late. The fall has already begun. No one ever thinks it will be them. No one ever thinks they'll be the one who falls. That's the trick of pride. It makes you believe that downfall is for other people, that the warnings don't apply to you, that your victories prove you're above the lessons of history, but history says otherwise. Over and over it shows us that those who rise with pride leading the way eventually fall. And it's not because they lacked strength. It's because they stopped checking their pride. They stopped asking the hard questions. They stopped seeking counsel. They stopped listening to the voice inside that said, be careful, stay humble, remember where you came from. Unchecked pride makes you deaf to truth. It makes you blind to your weaknesses. It makes you think that the applause will never stop, that the power will never fade, that the position will never be shaken. And so you stop growing. You stop preparing. You stop strengthening the foundation. And then the storm comes. The unexpected test, the moment of reckoning, and what was once built tall and proud crumbles. Because it wasn't built on wisdom, it wasn't built on humility, it wasn't built on truth, it was built on pride. The fall no one sees coming isn't invisible. The signs are always there. The problem is pride keeps you from seeing them. It keeps you looking outward when you should be looking inward. It keeps you focused on your victories when you should be reflecting on your vulnerabilities. It keeps you chasing bigger, louder, higher, when what you really need is to go deeper, to get stronger at the root, to build what can last through the storms. Pride unchecked is a quiet danger. It doesn't destroy you all at once. It erodes you. It chips away at your character. It weakens your relationships. It separates you from those who could help you see clearly. And by the time the fall comes, by the time the pride is stripped away, by the time the mask is torn off, you're left standing in the ruins wondering how it all happened so fast. But it wasn't fast. It started the moment pride told you you had nothing left to learn. The moment pride told you that humility was for the weak. The moment pride told you that the rules didn't apply to you. Pride unchecked turns strength into a weapon against yourself. It takes what should have been your greatest asset, your confidence, your vision, your determination, and twists it. It turns it into arrogance, into stubbornness, into blindness. And that's when the fall becomes inevitable. Because the higher you build on pride, the less stable your foundation becomes. And the higher you build on pride, the further you have to fall. Every fall that pride invites comes with a moment of truth, a moment where you see what pride kept you from seeing, a moment where the illusions are gone, where the applause is silent, where the power means nothing. And in that moment, you're left with yourself, with what's real, with what's true. And that's when the rebuilding can begin. But the price of unchecked pride is always the same, the fall you never thought would come. Power can lift you, build you, protect you, and shape the world around you. But power built on arrogance is a different kind of force. It doesn't create. It doesn't strengthen. It deceives. It whispers lies that sound like truth. It convinces you that you are above accountability, above the law, above the lessons that humble people learn through struggle. And the most dangerous part of power built on arrogance is that it looks strong on the outside, but beneath the surface, it is already crumbling. The cracks are already forming. The fall has already begun long before anyone sees it. Arrogance makes power hollow. It turns leadership into domination. It turns influence into control. It turns confidence into blindness. A person, a nation, a leader, or an empire that builds its power on arrogance stands on shaky ground. Because arrogance refuses to listen. It refuses to learn. It refuses to see beyond its own reflection. And when power becomes arrogant, it stops serving. It stops protecting. It stops building. Instead, it starts demanding. It starts expecting. It starts crushing. And that kind of power can only last so long before it collapses. The most dangerous thing about arrogance is that it hides the truth. It covers weakness with noise. It covers insecurity with threats. It covers fear with pride. Arrogance creates a false image of strength, but it has no real substance underneath. And because it refuses to reflect, because it refuses to adjust, because it refuses to face hard truths, the foundation of that power grows weaker and weaker. The world may see the show of force, the loud voice, the strong hand. But what they don't see is that behind closed doors, the walls are starting to crack. The silence before the fall is the silence arrogance creates when it drives away every voice that tried to warn, to guide, to steady the course. Power built on arrogance always isolates itself. It pushes away wise counsel. It pushes away those who tell the truth. It surrounds itself with flatterers, with yes men, with people who say what it wants to hear instead of what it needs to hear. And that isolation becomes its undoing. Because no power, no matter how great, can stand alone forever. No power can grow stronger when it refuses to be questioned, to be challenged, to be refined. Arrogance keeps power from adapting. It keeps power from seeing when change is necessary. And so power built on arrogance becomes rigid, brittle, and easy to break when the storm comes. And when it breaks in silence. Not with the roar of battle, not with the clash of mighty forces, but with a quiet collapse. Because arrogance spends so long pretending that everything is fine that by the time the fall begins, no one is left to care, no one is left to speak up, no one is left to stand with the fallen. Arrogance drives away loyalty. It burns bridges. It drains the goodwill that true power depends on. So when the fall comes, it comes alone, with no fanfare, with no support, with no one rushing in to save what has fallen. History is full of examples, empires that seemed unshakable, leaders who seemed invincible, movements that seemed unstoppable, all brought low not by an enemy's strength, but by their own arrogance. All crumbled not because they were attacked, but because they were hollow at the core. And that hollowness was hidden, denied, ignored until it was too late. Arrogance made it impossible to see the danger, impossible to hear the warning signs, impossible to take the steps that might have saved what was falling. Power built on arrogance forgets that real strength comes from humility. It forgets that leadership is about service, not self-glorification. It forgets that influence is earned, not owed. And because it forgets, it falls. Not always in a moment of crisis, sometimes in slow decline, sometimes in quiet decay, but always in the end, with the silence that follows when the world stops paying attention to what no longer deserves respect. Power built on arrogance can look impressive for a season. It can fool the world. It can even fool itself, but it cannot last. Because at its core, it lacks what every lasting power must have, the ability to see itself clearly, to grow, to change, to serve something greater than its own ego. And when that kind of power falls, it falls quietly, because the noise that once surrounded it was only an echo of its own arrogance, not a reflection of real strength. When justice and injustice clash, there is always a test not just of the people involved in the struggle, but of those watching from the sidelines. The test is simple. Will you stand with what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs, even when it means losing friends, facing criticism, risking comfort, security, reputation? Most fail that test. Most choose to stay quiet, to stay neutral, to convince themselves that it's not their fight, not their problem, not their place to speak. And in doing so, they give injustice room to breathe, room to spread, room to continue. The world often looks away because justice is demanding. Justice asks something of you. It asks for courage. It asks for sacrifice. It asks for action. It asks you to step out of the crowd, to risk standing alone, to bear the weight of doing what's right when doing what's easy would serve you better in the short term. Injustice, on the other hand, requires nothing of the bystander. Injustice thrives in silence. Injustice feeds on indifference. Injustice gains power every time someone says it's not my responsibility. Every time someone says it's not my concern. Every time someone says I'll let someone else deal with it. And that's how injustice wins, not just through the actions of those who spread it, but through the inaction of those who let it happen. Through the millions of small choices to look away, to change the channel, to scroll past, to shake your head and move on. Justice and injustice clash every day in the streets, in the halls of power, in conversations behind closed doors. And every time they do, the world has a choice. Speak or stay silent, act or stand by. And too often, the choice is silence. It's easy to cheer for justice after the battle is won. It's easy to stand on the right side of history once history has already made its judgment. But in the moment, in the heat of the clash, when the outcome is uncertain, when the cost of standing up is high, that's when silence does its damage. That's when injustice gains ground. Because justice doesn't win on its own. Justice needs voices. Justice needs action. Justice needs people willing to risk comfort for conscience. And when those people are few, injustice grows stronger. The world often chooses to look away because injustice doesn't always show up as a villain. Sometimes it shows up dressed in tradition. Sometimes it shows up wrapped in the flag. Sometimes it shows up speaking the language of safety, of security, of order. And it takes courage to see through the disguise. It takes courage to name injustice for what it is, especially when it's unpopular, especially when it challenges the status quo, especially when it forces people to see things they'd rather ignore. And so many choose the easier path, the path that lets them sleep at night without the burden of action, the path that lets them believe they are good people, even as they do nothing. History is filled with moments where the world looked away, where people who had the power to make a difference stayed silent. And in those moments, injustice flourished. Not because it was stronger, not because it was right, but because silence gave it room to grow, because indifference gave it permission to stay, because the clash between justice and injustice was decided not just by those on the front lines, but by those who chose to stand back and watch. Every time justice and injustice clash, the world is watching. And every time the world is judged by its choice. Do we stand for what's right, or do we look away? Do we speak when it matters, or do we stay silent to protect ourselves? Do we act, or do we wait for someone else to carry the burden? These are the choices that define not just nations, but individuals. These are the choices that show who we are, what we value, what kind of world we're willing to live in. And every time injustice rises, every time it challenges justice, every time it forces a choice, the world reveals itself not by what it says after the fact, but by what it does in the moment when it matters most. When the world measures strength, it so often looks to the surface. It counts weapons, it weighs armies, it tallies up resources, technology, and wealth. It looks at power through the lens of might. Who has the biggest, who can strike the fastest, who can dominate the loudest. But real strength isn't measured by might alone. The true test of a nation's strength is in its humility, because might can be built, bought, and displayed. Humility, though, humility is earned, and it is rare. It's the unseen force that determines whether power will be used to build or to destroy, to serve or to control, to lead or to crush. Humility is what keeps a nation grounded when it rises. It's what reminds those in power that strength is not a license to do whatever they please, but a responsibility to do what is right. Humility checks the ego. It balances pride. It asks hard questions when victory tempts arrogance. A nation that grows strong without humility at its core builds a tower with no foundation. It might reach high, but it cannot stand long. The winds of time, the storms of consequence will bring it down. And history is full of examples of mighty nations that crumbled, not because they weren't powerful, but because they lost their humility along the way. Humility means listening before acting. It means understanding that no matter how great the strength, no matter how high the position, there is always more to learn. There are always consequences to weigh. There are always voices worth hearing, even when they offer criticism, even when they challenge the plan, even when they say what no one wants to hear. A humble nation doesn't fear dissent. A humble nation doesn't silence truth. A humble nation seeks wisdom over applause, justice over dominance, peace over pride, and that is where true strength lives. A nation's strength isn't tested in moments of victory, when the crowds cheer and the world watches in awe. It's tested in the aftermath, in the choices made when the battle is over, when the power is in hand, when no one is left to resist. What does that nation do then? Does it use its strength to lift others up or to push them down? Does it remember the cost of its own rise, or does it rewrite the story to glorify itself alone? These are the questions that reveal the soul of a nation, and humility is the answer that separates the truly strong from the merely powerful. Humility in a nation means knowing that strength is not invincibility. It means understanding that no nation stands forever on might alone, that no wall is too high to fall, no army too vast to falter, no empire too great to crumble. It means learning from the past, not erasing it. It means honoring not just victories but mistakes, because in mistakes, in failures, in setbacks, there is wisdom. And wisdom is what gives strength its depth. Wisdom is what gives power its purpose. Wisdom is what turns might into something meaningful, something lasting, something that serves not just the few, but the many. Nations that forget humility lose their way. They start to believe their own myths. They start to think that power justifies everything. They stop asking, is this right? And only ask, is this possible? And that is the beginning of the fall, because might without humility is like a ship with no rudder. It moves fast, it looks impressive, but it has no direction, no anchor, no way to stay steady when the seas grow rough. Humility teaches restraint, it teaches patience, it teaches the value of peace, the strength in diplomacy, the power of understanding. It reminds a nation that strength is not just about what it can take, but about what it chooses to give. Not just about how high it can rise, but about how well it can lift others as it does. Not just about how loud it can speak, but about how carefully it can listen. Humility keeps a nation's strength focused on what matters. Without it, strength becomes reckless. Without it, strength becomes dangerous. Without it, strength turns on itself. Every nation will face moments that test its humility. Moments when it can choose the hard right over the easy wrong. Moments when it can choose to act with compassion instead of conquest. Moments when it can choose to see beyond its own pride, its own comfort, its own immediate gain. And those moments reveal more about a nation's strength than any display of force ever could, because might can win battles, but humility wins respect. Humility builds trust. Humility earns a place in history not as a tyrant, not as a destroyer, but as a leader, as a nation that understood its power and chose to use it with wisdom, with care, with grace. Strength without humility is short-lived. It burns bright and fast, and then it fades. But strength guided by humility, that is the kind of strength that endures. That is the kind of strength that outlasts empires, that outshines weapons, that leaves a legacy not of fear, but of honor. And that is the kind of strength the world remembers, not because it had to, but because it chose to. When people think of resilience, they often picture force. They imagine strength that overpowers, might that crushes obstacles, determination that refuses to bend. They think of resilience as domination, the ability to win at all costs, to stand above, to prove superiority. But real resilience is something deeper. Real resilience isn't about how hard you can hit or how high you can climb over others. Real resilience is about how willing you are to look in the mirror after you fall, after you fail, after you face what humbles you, and choose to rise better, wiser, stronger because of it. Domination may look like resilience from the outside, but it's not. Domination is about control. It's about forcing outcomes. It's about masking fear with power. A person or a nation that defines resilience by domination misses the point. Because when the storm comes, when the battle is over, when the dust settles, domination leaves you empty. It leaves you isolated. It leaves you blind to what truly builds strength. True resilience is not about how much you can take from the world. It's about how much you can learn from the world. It's about how much you're willing to change when life shows you who you are. Reflection is where resilience begins. Reflection takes courage because it asks you to stop pointing the finger at everyone else and start asking yourself the hard questions. What did I miss? Where did I go wrong? How can I grow from this? Reflection forces you to slow down when the world says speed up. It forces you to get quiet when the noise of domination says speak louder. It forces you to take responsibility for your part, not just celebrate your victories or blame your defeats on others. And that is what separates the truly resilient from those who are simply fighting for control. Growth is the fruit of reflection. When you reflect honestly, when you let the truth humble you instead of harden you, you open the door to growth. And growth is the foundation of resilience that lasts. Because domination might win battles, but growth wins the war within yourself. Growth builds the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout, the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself at every turn, the kind of strength that can bend without breaking, that can adapt without losing its core, that can fall and still find the will to stand again. True resilience means looking at what tested you and seeing not just the pain, but the lesson. It means choosing to rise not in spite of what happened, but because of what you learned from it. It means refusing to let your scars make you bitter and letting them make you better instead. It means knowing that you don't have to dominate others to prove your worth. You don't have to crush to stand tall. You don't have to silence others to speak with strength. You don't have to control everything to stay steady in the storm. The world often confuses domination with resilience because domination looks powerful in the moment. It looks decisive. It looks victorious. But domination is short-term. It feeds the ego, not the soul. It builds walls, not bridges. It wins applause, not respect. And when the time comes to face the next challenge, domination offers no foundation to stand on because domination teaches you to fight harder, not to grow wiser. It teaches you to push more, not to reflect deeper. And so when domination fails, as it always does eventually, there's nothing left to hold you up. Resilience built on reflection and growth is different. It's quiet strength. It's steady strength. It's the kind of strength that doesn't panic when tested because it knows how to adapt, how to learn, how to turn struggle into wisdom. It's the kind of strength that listens as much as it speaks, that asks as much as it answers, that gives as much as it takes. It's the kind of strength that earns respect because it respects itself enough to keep growing, to keep improving, to keep rising without needing to push others down. True resilience shows up not in how much you can dominate, but in how much you can evolve. It shows up in the choices you make after the fight, in the way you treat those you could crush, but choose to lift instead, in the way you face your failures, not with denial, but with determination to be better, in the way you use your power not to dominate, but to serve, to heal, to build something that lasts. Reflection and growth require humility. They require the strength to admit you don't have all the answers. They require the courage to face yourself honestly. They require the discipline to keep going, not just harder, but smarter. And that is the heart of true resilience. Not domination, not control, not the illusion of power, but the steady, quiet, unshakable strength that comes from learning, growing, and rising again and again, no matter how many times you are tested. There are moments in history when the world goes quiet, moments when injustice unfolds in plain sight, moments when power is abused, when pride is humbled, when truth is overshadowed by might, and the world chooses not to speak. And in that silence, there's a reflection that doesn't just show us what happened out there, but shows us who we are, because the silence of the world is a mirror, and what it reveals is not about the event itself, but about our response, or lack of one. When the world stays silent, it forces every individual, every leader, every nation to ask hard questions. What did we stand for? What did we tolerate? What did we choose to ignore? The silence doesn't let us hide behind excuses. It doesn't let us claim we didn't see. It doesn't let us pretend we didn't know. Because deep down, the truth is always visible to those willing to look. And when the world goes quiet, that quiet speaks louder than words. It reminds us that injustice didn't go unchallenged because it was hidden. It went unchallenged because we allowed it. Silence reveals our fears. It reveals our priorities. It reveals what we value and what we're willing to sacrifice in the name of comfort, in the name of safety, in the name of not rocking the boat. The world's silence isn't just about apathy. Sometimes it's about fear of getting involved, fear of being judged, fear of standing alone, fear of losing position, power, privilege. And so, the easy choice is to say nothing, to do nothing, to look the other way. But the mirror of silence forces us to see that choice for what it is. A choice not to act is still a choice. The silence of the world is a test of conscience. It asks, who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when there's no reward for speaking out? Who are you when standing up might cost you something? And that's a test that too many fail, because speaking up is risky. Acting on conscience takes courage, and silence offers an escape from that risk. But the mirror of silence doesn't lie. It shows us the gap between who we say we are and who we really are. It shows us the space between our values and our actions. It shows us the truth that no amount of words can cover. When the world stays silent, it forces those who suffer to stand alone, and that loneliness reflects back on all of us. It asks, why did we let them stand alone? Why did we let fear stop us from doing what was right? Why did we value our comfort more than their dignity, their safety, their lives? The silence of the world echoes these questions long after the moment has passed, and the answers we give, not in words, but in how we live, how we lead, how we choose the next time. Those answers define our character. The mirror of silence doesn't just reflect individuals, it reflects nations, it reflects systems, it reflects entire societies. It shows whether we stand for justice only when it's easy or whether we stand when it's hard, whether we speak up only when the crowd agrees or whether we speak when the crowd goes quiet, whether we act only when it benefits us or whether we act because it's the right thing to do, regardless of the cost. The silence of the world forces nations to confront the legacy they're building, a legacy shaped not just by what they did, but by what they allowed. And in that silence, there is also an invitation to change, an invitation to break the pattern, an invitation to become the kind of people, the kind of leaders, the kind of nations that don't wait for permission to do what's right. Because the mirror of silence isn't meant to condemn us, it's meant to wake us up. It's meant to show us where we fell short so we can rise better, so we can choose differently, so we can break the habit of looking away. The silence of the world reminds us that the loudest voices aren't always the ones that shape history. Sometimes it's the moments of silence that define us, the moments when we could have spoken but didn't, the moments when we could have acted but froze, the moments when we could have made a difference but chose safety instead. And the mirror reflects all of that back at us, not to shame us, but to challenge us, to ask, what will you do next time? Because there will always be a next time. Another moment when justice and injustice collide. Another moment when the world pauses to see who will stand, who will speak, who will choose conscience over comfort. The silence of the world forces us to see that change doesn't start out there. It starts within. It starts with the individual who decides to break the silence. It starts with the leader who chooses principle over popularity. It starts with the nation that decides its strength will be measured not by its might, but by its moral courage. And that kind of change begins the moment we stop looking away and start facing the reflection in the mirror of silence. When pride rises unchecked, when power is built on arrogance, when justice collides with injustice and the world turns away, when nations forget that true strength is measured by humility, when resilience is mistaken for domination, and when silence becomes the mirror that forces us to see ourselves, we are left with one undeniable truth. The real test of any people, any leader, any nation is not how high they stand in moments of comfort, but how they respond in moments of reckoning. It is not the weapons we build, the power we project, or the victories we claim that define us. It is the choices we make when pride blinds us, when arrogance tempts us, when injustice demands our voice, when humility calls for reflection, when resilience asks for growth, and when the silence of the world forces us to face our own conscience. The true measure of greatness is found not in domination, but in the courage to look inward, to change, to stand for what is right even when it costs, and to build a legacy that future generations will not just remember but respect.